Hey, everybody. Mark and I have over 20 years of experience as therapists and as addicts in long-term successful recovery. We know better than anyone what works and what doesn't to break out of porn and sex addiction, heal betrayal trauma, and reclaim your relationship.
And we've poured all of our personal and professional recovery and healing experience into a first-of-its-kind program for addicts, spouses, and couples. We call it Dare to Connect.
At least 4 times every week, we engage with you in real time, in the trenches, giving you the knowledge and the tools to take back your life and relationship.
Whatever else you've done on your journey for healing and recovery, you've never done anything like this.
Mark and I, we've made all the mistakes, so you don't have to. Don't reinvent the wheel.
We all know tomorrow never comes. Look, don't wait one more day to change. Claim your free 2-week trial today at daretoconnectnow.com.
Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast. Well, Mark, hey, I loved our conversation last week. I thought it was really cool to be able to explore and talk about different areas in which, if we could go back in time in our recoveries individually, what we would have done different as addicts. And it was a cool kind of reminiscing experience for me and brought to mind, some memories that I had forgotten about. And I'm excited this week because we're going to take that kind of the next level, and we're going to have a similar discussion, but it's going to be about marriage. If you and I could go back as addicts in this whole navigating the couple side of the relationship and the issues involved, what would we have done different? I know that for me, I spent well into the 5 figures on therapy. in my and that's not a joke in my recovery process, and I could have probably kept it to 4 if if I'd taken some of the advice and some of the things that we're going to talk about today, because there was so much resistance, especially to this whole concept of recovering the marriage and the intricacies involved. And so I think this is going to be awesome to jump into.
Yeah, it's, last week was great. What would I have done different in my addiction? But for many of the people that we work with and a lot of people listening here, addiction isn't just about me. Addiction has an enormous impact on our spouse.
Yes.
So if we're going to talk about what would we do different, it has to include a discussion about what would I do different in my relationship, in my marriage. And so that's what we're about today. We're going to talk about that.
Love it.
And so, let's just launch into it. So, for me, one of the things as I look back and reflect, as my wife, as before she was my wife, as we were courting and dating, I wanted to put forth the best foot possible. I wanted to put on the right image. I wanted her to think the best of me, right? I mean, this person's trying to make a decision. Am I going to spend the rest of my life with this guy? So you want to be really impressive. And so I was pretty good at that, putting on a show, we might call it. And I know everyone kind of does that to an extent.
Sure.
I think I carried that probably to the extreme. And today, as my wife and I are in a really super healthy place. But as we look back, we can joke about that now. And she'll often say, there was a time in our marriage where I suddenly looked at you and said, who is this guy? Because this is not the guy I was dating.
Yeah.
And she just talks about how there's a feeling of kind of shock and fear and some betrayal and some anger and like, who are you and what have you done with the guy that I dated?
Yeah.
And so, if I could do something different, I would definitely be more authentic, more transparent in the early part of the relationship. Dare to be myself, dare to peel, to take off the masks, peel back the facades, and I'm just going to let you see me. 'Cause
Yeah.
this is who you're marrying. You're marrying me. And I was afraid if she knew that who that was, she wouldn't marry that guy. So I
Yeah.
had to be somebody else.
Yeah. Well, in my history with that was a little bit different from yours, as you know. I actually was pretty open with my wife about what we were dealing with, in terms of, I disclosed where I had a pornography problem and things, but while we were still dating, which is, I think I've said before, probably one of the only good things I did about recovery before really getting into it, in a serious way. But even as I was open about it, right, and as transparent as I could be, I had no idea what the crap I was really dealing with. Neither one of us did. We went into this whole thing terribly naive, thinking that we had this little issue that was going to be pretty easy to overcome, and et cetera, et cetera. And for the first while in our marriage, for the first year and a half, there were no issues. I didn't have any issues with the addiction, largely due to like that novelty, right, of getting a sexual fix or a sexual release, in other ways. But just like you and I've talked about, at the end of the day, this addiction has very little to do with sex. And, little by little, that thing just reared its head and came back in. And my wife started expressing the same things like, what happened? Except it was, our first year of marriage was great. Like, what's going on? Like, this is just weird. And no husband, I think, wants to hear from their wife. Nobody wants to hear their spouse express buyer's remorse,
Yeah, right.
about the marriage. It's one of the hardest things to hear. And so I'm excited we're jumping into this stuff because, hopefully, you men and women out there who are listening, you won't have to reinvent the wheel quite as much as, Mark and I have had to do.
Yeah, we can save you years or decades of trauma and strife in your marriage relationship. If you take a lesson from us and a lot of people that we've worked with. So along with that, I would have been much more authentic and transparent and dared to show my wife the real me as we
Yeah.
started to make commitments to each other. Another thing that I think about as I look back is I was raised in a culture where a man does things himself. You pull
Yeah.
yourself up by your bootstraps. You handle it. You don't
Yeah.
get all touchy feely and start to express all of these deep down emotions and fears and all this other. What is all that anyway? I mean, the joke we often have with for a guy, there's only three emotions that exist in the world, right? You're either mad, sad, or glad, and there isn't anything else, and nothing else matters anyway.
Yeah.
And so I just had this thing where I had to handle whatever hard things came up. You handle them yourself,
Yeah.
and that was what was modeled to me by the stepdads that kind of raised me. They were kind of these macho guys, and you just got the job done, and you didn't
Yeah.
engage other people in it. So I would definitely have tried to get help for that attitude and learned that me alone is not even remotely close to as powerful as this concept of we together. But I didn't know how to do that. I just knew when
Yeah.
things got tough, you hunkered down, you isolated, you gritted your teeth, you clenched your fists, and you just did what you had to do. And
Yeah.
that was very distancing from my wife. She knew something was going on, but I wouldn't talk about it. I wouldn't be totally honest or transparent. She just knew that suddenly Mark's mood has changed. Suddenly he's down. He's closed off. What's going on? I don't know, but something's wrong.
Yeah.
And I just didn't include her or anyone. I just tried, quote, to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and for me, it was kind of a similar upbringing, and then you couple it with the culture that you and I have been raised in many respects. This idea of, it already is kind of a cultural thing, in a conservative Christian culture of, you know, I'm the one who made the mistake. It's my problem to fix it, right? And then that gets amplified with this whole man's man concept. Not only is it my problem and it's my job to fix it, I can't even have emotions about it. It's just handle it, right? And I've got to be kind of like the emotional and physical and whatever else, like SEAL Team 6 in my marriage, and just, tackle it all on my own, kind of a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's that knight in shining armor complex, right? Because that was the struggle for me, as I was in the marriage. It was kind of a mix of what you're describing, and then also this idea of, like, my job is to be my wife's protector, right? Protect her from all things bad and scary, to, make sure that she's happy all the time. And a lot of guys I know can resonate with that. And if you've been listening to our podcast for a while now, sounds a little like codependency, in a not so healthy way. And the reality is, I think the irony with this approach, because you and I see this in our offices, like with probably most clients, right? Um, I know that's the case for me. There's this initial notion of, for whatever the reason, whatever the logic, like, I got to handle this and keep her isolated from it and whatever else. Now, to be fair, I think that I will own the fact that for me, that in part was also an excuse, right? Not to have to get really vulnerable. But there was that legitimate piece that's just like, it's not okay to make mistakes. This is not her problem. And the issue with that is, the irony is, what we're doing out of a place of love is actually the thing that is going to end the marriage quicker than probably the acting out in many cases, right?
Yeah.
As you and I've talked about, I've personally, I've worked with hundreds of women by this point in my career. And I can tell you that hands down, I hear that across the board all the time. The sex piece bothers me, but it's not knowing who this guy is. Kind of going back to what you were saying, right? I feel like I'm just married to a stranger. I had one wife kind of tell me, more or less, when my husband comes home, I can almost envision in my mind, it's like we're just spinning the wheel of fortune wheel to see what kind of comes up,
Yeah.
who's coming in the door. I don't know who it is. And that actually is much more traumatizing than this addict piece.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing for me. There was there was the part of me that was so ashamed and didn't want anyone to know about this, so I kept it hidden and isolated and stealthy. But there was a really legitimate side to me, and I think this is the case for nearly every guy. I really didn't want to hurt my wife.
Yes.
And when you do quote come clean and divulge something, this hurt look, this painful, dejected look on your wife's face is just enough to kill you. And I would just be, I can't do that to her again.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's legitimate in not wanting to hurt her. But like you said, there was also part of me, that little ego addict brain, that was a convenient excuse
Yes.
to not divulge and get help and get real about this. So it's this strange mix, this strange paradox. I don't want to hurt her. Oh, it just kills me to see the pain in her face. But then I go out and do the very things that hurt her.
Yeah.
And it's that's why we call addiction insanity. It doesn't make sense. so
Absolutely. No,
so
you're absolutely right. Even when you walk a wife through that process, right, in that line of mental thinking, they'll say, I guess I could see how that maybe could happen. That
yeah,
just sounds really odd to me.
wait, you didn't want to hurt me, but then you went and did what?
Sure. Absolutely. There's a whole dichotomy there. Well, let's talk about how to alleviate this then, because I mean, obviously, I think most of our listeners can at least our male listeners or our addict listeners can definitely resonate to this concept. How do we shift that and make that shift quicker? I mean, I can tell you that for me, uh, again, going back to this, spending so much more on therapy than I needed to. I unfortunately was so close-minded to this idea of being vulnerable and open that I really, that first probably 6 months of meeting with my therapist was basically just paying him to strip down my armor,
Mm,
right? And that was everything from the shame, right, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, to to just this whole line of cultural thinking that we had hardwired into us, right? To even to be able to even get to a place where we're actually going to do therapy. Like there was
Yes.
kind of it's sort of like an emotional remodel of a house. That first 6 months was just tearing out the crap so we could actually get to work on doing something different. And I think that there are a lot of pieces to that. And I know these bullet points we've got are going to kind of bleed one into the other. And I'm curious to hear your thought on, I mean, what's a good first step for these guys to be able to do what we're talking about, to be able to start breaking that down?
Hey, everybody. Mark and Steve here. Are you looking to take your recovery and your marriage to the next level?
We work with individuals and couples one-on-one.
With both in-person and online therapy options, you have access to the experts anytime, anywhere.
To learn more, visit us at pbscpodcast.com.
Well, I'll tell you what it was. Unfortunately, what it was like for me is I had to get to a really desperate low place where I had literally exhausted every single other option.
Yes.
There was nothing left. And it's like, okay, there's nothing left. I'm about to
Yeah.
completely implode. My marriage is on the rocks. My health is shot to hell. I
Mhm.
got nothing left. Maybe I
Yeah.
should get some help. It's like, wow,
Yep.
that's what it takes for you to get to the place where you're willing to admit you need some help.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was like that for me. And so the first step is just to get to the place where you can set your ego and your pride, which are really just protection mechanisms for my own insecurities and my own fears. You got to just set that aside and say, okay, you know what? I like to call it cry uncle. I
Mhm.
remember when I was a kid, we'd get in little tussles and fights, and I was so stubborn. If another kid would like get me in a headlock and he's like choking me, ready to black me out, there
Mhm.
was no way I was tapping on the mat or crying uncle.
Sure.
That guy
Yeah.
could choke me into death, and I was not going to say I give.
Mhm.
And I finally got to the place in my addiction now where I said, okay, I cry uncle. I give. I got nothing left. And it took a lot to get
Yeah.
to that place. So I tell guys, get to the place where you're willing to, quote, cry uncle and give in and say, you know what? I can't do this. I'm not capable of handling this. I need help.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and if I was to kind of add to that, how to accelerate that process, because you're right. I mean, the sad reality is that probably the majority of my clients, and myself included, right? My story mirrors exactly that in those terms. It was, as you and I have talked about many times, we know how to do this process well, not just because of training and because of backgrounds and certifications or whatever else. It's because we did it all the wrong flipping ways. Right? We tried every other way before we finally got to the one that would work. And so I definitely can tie in with that. I mean, if I was to kind of add to that, how to accelerate this process, I would probably say the following. Now, I give a caveat that if you're going to ask questions in your relationship, and this is just good marriage advice in general, then you need to be prepared for whatever answer you get.
Yeah.
Um, don't be asking questions if you're not in a place where you can take those answers and not get defensive about them. But some hard questions to ask if your wife is able or in a safe enough place to be vulnerable with you might be, are you scared of me? That's a hard question to ask. But I hear
Mm.
from a lot of wives, they are scared of their husbands. Not in that he's gonna, physically beat them or attack them necessarily, but much more so from that place of every time I try to talk to you about something, you shut me down every single time, in a variety of ways, right? And I just feel like every time I try to say something or contribute something or express something, it's just I run into this imaginary, invisible, but very present, like cinder block wall that I just cannot get past, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that brings up this concept of, getting behind the anger.
Yes.
In addiction. I know that anger or resentment looks like a lot of different things for different guys. Some guys, they shut down. Sometimes they become aggressive, which was my case, right? But the problem is as long as you're hiding behind or shielding yourself with the anger, either at yourself, your spouse, your situation, and it's going to limit your ability to be able to ask tough questions like that and to be able to start getting to that process of figuring out what is really going on for you.
Yeah, my wife and I have talked about that a lot, now when we're so healthy. And I actually asked that tough question that you mentioned.
Mm,
And what I asked her was, when, in our early years, did I intimidate you?
mm,
And
yeah.
her response was quick and sure. Yes, you did.
Mm,
And it was kind of shocking to me. I'm like, wow, really? She's like, yeah,
mm,
you were very intimidating. Every time I would try to bring something up or express my true feelings or get into a really raw conversation, you would shut me down. You would
yeah.
just close me off like I didn't matter, like you
Yeah.
didn't care what I had to say. You wouldn't face it, you wouldn't deal with it, and you were very intimidating.
Yep.
And she said, finally, I just settled with the fact that that's just the way it was going to be. And she said, I basically just, she said, I had kids to raise.
Mm,
And so I
yeah.
just went about raising our kids.
Oh boy.
And
Yeah.
I just couldn't, you weren't gonna open up or come through. That's a hard thing for a guy to hear.
Oh my
Wow.
gosh. No kidding.
You just raised our kids and we're a mom and just said, he's going to do what he's going to do. I got kids here. I can't worry about it.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, really? You actually had to be resigned at that level.
Yeah.
So that was hard for me to hear because I didn't consider myself to be an intimidating guy. I
Mm,
didn't think that I was like being mean or, trying to dominate her or any of those things. But boy, I was sure coming across that way,
yeah.
as closed-minded, as narcissistic, all of the things. And as I look back, it's like, wow, you know what? That's true.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you said, what's under the anger? I would use anger or resentment or being upset as a distraction.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't have to deal with hard issues or get to my core stuff with my wife. All I had to do was get mad or shut down, and it would divert the whole thing
Yeah.
off of the real issue. Yeah, it's a really crafty little ego tactic. Let's just use this extreme emotion and everything, all the focus shifts away from the real issue. Look at
Yeah.
that. It's
Yeah.
magic.
Well, and that's the thing I think that, is the most damning about this dynamic that we're talking about and why I wish you and I had done it so differently and why we're kind of pleading and imploring with you guys and gals out there to do it differently is because you're losing, everyone's losing with doing it the way that we're describing, right? As long as you're hiding behind the anger, because let's just be honest, let's all level with each other. I can tell you that I used to, anger was like my sword and shield, of defense. I would just get aggressive and put people down and use the superiority tactic and whatever intellectualism with my wife and whatever else I could to not have to look at my own stuff. But the thing of it is it was absolutely 100% causing the exact opposite of what I was wanting, right? Because remember, I'm doing all this to why? I'm doing it to protect my wife, quote unquote, right, to a degree. I'm doing it because I don't want to burden her to a degree. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying, yeah, you know what? I'm not going to put this real backpack on your back. But instead, I've got good news for you. I've got a backpack that weighs probably 3 times as much that I'm going to make you carry instead. Right? It's just it's shifting that emotional torment in a whole other way. Um and so you not only are you not I don't know how else to say this. Not only are you trying to stop acting out, right? So you're having to get rid of your coping mechanism. Not only are you trying to recover, right? And do this alone, which again, let's be honest, being angry is exhausting.
Yeah.
It's exhausting. It will, I mean, I can speak to personal experience with that. Holding up that wall all the time was exhausting. And then and again, everybody loses because then what does that all come at a cost of? The intimacy with my wife, the closest with my partner. which was the very damn thing that I was trying to avoid in the first place.
Yeah, right. We don't want to admit that we're uncomfortable with true intimacy, right?
Yes.
Into me, you see. Into you, I see. And we're not taught that growing up. That's a scary thing. I'm not going to let you see into me. Are you nuts?
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
we got to put up facades and masks and go through all these gyrations. And I'll tell you, you know, you mentioned anger. What's under the anger? That wasn't actually my primary strategy.
Mhm.
The strategy I learned growing up from the example of stepfathers was the silent treatment. So
Yeah.
I would see men when they would get uncomfortable and not want to confront the real issues going on, they would just go quiet, turn
Gotcha.
into
Yeah.
stone, not say a blasted word, not show any emotion. And boy, you want to cause trauma to a woman, you want to cause trauma to your wife, just go into absolute stone cold silence.
Absolutely.
That is abuse,
Mhm.
every bit as much as the anger. And so I had to ask myself, okay, so what's under the silence? What's under you retreating and isolating and going cold? What's that about?
Yeah.
And getting to the place where you can actually start to confront that. And before this podcast, you and I talked about this next concept that we have on our list, which ties in perfectly with this. It's about getting into the place in your marriage, and this is what we both agreed we would have done different, becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Yep.
And it's such a power, we could do like 10 podcasts just on that topic alone.
Mhm.
But getting to the place where I'm willing to sit in the crap. I'm willing to get down in the ashes with you, with all the things that we were taught you don't talk about, you don't confront, right? Because I have to make sure my wife is perfectly happy all the time. If she
Yes.
doesn't have a smile on her face, something's horribly wrong and I've got to fix it. God forbid we'd actually have to have tough conversations.
Yeah.
And so, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Like, how in the world do you do that? Like,
Yeah.
there was a time when I would have just looked at you like you're a crazy person. What are you even talking about?
Yeah. Well,
Like,
it's a great question, and it's a hard one, and you have to kind of start with a premise that we've mentioned on our podcast before. As an addict, part of what you have to own, if you fit into that category, well, first is just owning you're an addict, right? See podcast episode 1 and 2 for that. But beyond that, it's being able to really get a, how would I say it? It's about being able to learn to sit in the pain,
yep.
right? Because as addicts, we are pain averse. I have yet to run across one who wasn't. People in general are pain averse. Addicts will run from pain at all costs, far more so than even the typical. And when we get in those situations, where our spouse they start to express intimacy or closeness or an important concept or a feeling that they've got, instantly our brain starts bringing to mind, right, all of these ways of shutting that down. Again, aggression, turning off. I love what you're talking about with the silent treatment. I regret to say that was an evolution in my in my addiction. I didn't pick that one up till later, but yeah, before my wife and I found recovery, holy cow, it would be like 3 days of just being like, we would literally walk past each other going up and down the stairs. I won't even make eye contact with her.
Yeah.
Awful. It's just,
Yeah. I call that married singles.
yes, absolutely. It wasn't even roommates. It was just, it was two people pretending like they both live single in the home. And if you're talking about getting uncomfortable, it is learning about it is practicing. I think initially where that starts is just practicing it. Setting yourself up, sitting yourself down with a conversation and using some coping skills. Again, this is where therapy becomes so important because it does take some work to be able to get to this point. But even with just little things, start not immediately responding to what your spouse says, right? We're so reactive as addicts. It's just like, to anything. It's not just to this anger stuff, it's to the triggers themselves, right? We're almost like impulsive with it. And being able, I'll tell you what, you want to know one of the best ways I could have reduced all this therapy and pain? I probably could have cut this process in half if I had just practiced what I call taking a break, which is at a baseline, simply taking 30 seconds to 1 minute before you respond to something. Because in my experience, 9 times out of 10, people would not say, especially us addicts, we would not say or do or respond in the ways that we do, even if we just gave it that little bit of time.
Yeah, just a pause.
Yeah.
We're going to talk more about this next week because we already agreed we're going to continue this, what I do different in my marriage, because there's
Yeah.
so much to talk about.
Yes, there is.
But just this concept of we're in such me mode in marriage and in addiction. I'm so focused on myself. I'm
Yeah.
so self-protective. I'm so fragile. And this is what guys have a hard time admitting. This is what I couldn't admit in my addiction years, that I was fragile. There were
Yeah.
broken parts of me, and I would rather die than admit that.
Yeah.
And so we get into a conversation where my wife begins to talk raw and real about what's going on, and immediately I'm so fragile and broken inside, I can't take it. It's
Yeah.
like up goes the shield, up goes the guard, and we're in war. It's like I'm going to
Totally.
protect myself. And so what do? She says something, and bam, I'm reacting. I'm immediately jumping on her because I'm self-protecting. I'm protecting the fragile, vulnerable, painful parts of me deep down that are driving the addiction in the first place.
Yeah.
And as soon as any conversation starts to go there to sort of start to peel back those layers, it's like, nope, here comes survival brain, macho brain. We're not going there. In fact, how dare you say that to me? I'm gonna immediately pounce on you. And it's all
Absolutely.
about avoidance. It's
Oh
just,
gosh.
yeah.
Yeah, I could share 100 examples as you're just talking. There's just like, it's like flashing images
I
one
know,
after
right?
another of all these things that I said and did over the years that I wish I could just take back. Yeah, there is so much more to cover here, guys. So we'll, but in our spirit of making a commitment to you not to drag these podcasts out, we're going to try and adhere to our 30 minutes as much as we can. So if we were to give you something to work on this week, I think it would probably be the following. And this first one would be specifically for you addicts out there. It's an expansion on what we were just talking about. I would recommend, if you're able to, this is a huge caveat, but if your relationship is in a place where you and your spouse are both willing to give it a try, set a time, designate it, do some journaling, use some of the other coping skills we've talked about beforehand, but set a time where you're going to pick one small thing that is hard for either for your spouse to talk about or for you to own, either one. And then set yourself a timer and try to talk about it for 5 to 10 minutes and see how it goes. I know that may sound small to the average person, but for an addict, that 5 or 10 minutes will seem like 6 eternities, because it is such an uncomfortable place. So I think that we would do that, and then also getting behind that anger piece is important as well. When you start to feel an averseness to what a spouse is expressing to you, right? Be it her own ideas, her own emotions, her own thoughts, and it doesn't even have to be around recovery, right? When you start feeling that averseness, start just paying attention to that. Start utilizing that mindfulness concept that we've talked about, and include that in your journaling, right? Like, my wife is talking about, there's a recipe I really want to make for dinner. Why is that pissing me off? Like, I'm, like, what about that is it? I mean, I think a lot of what you're going to find is that in many ways it boils back to that insecurity that Mark alluded to. And we'll talk more about that next week as well.
Yeah, I like that assignment for everybody, to pick a don't pick the big giant firestorm
No.
issues.
No.
We're going to sit down and talk about the really big stuff. Just pick something small, some little disagreement or something that irks you, or and then when you do sit down, as Steve says, to just talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes, do adhere to some really basic little principles. In other words, don't talk over each other. Don't go into reactive mode. This isn't well, you said, and so I'm going to say, right, this whole competition or reactive thing. Just simply give each of you the opportunity to just simply express while you're quiet. And I know this is going to be painfully difficult to close your mouth and not react or defend or question or say, yeah, but you just give them a chance to talk. And
Yes.
when they've done it and they've talked, now they basically, give the talking stick to you, so to speak. Now you talk and I will listen.
Yeah.
Just a really basic thing.
I just chuckled because the talking stick you just talked about, I think I shared this once on another episode. My wife and I actually had to get one.
You got
We
a talking
we
stick?
had a real deal, one of those 99-cent Walmart little clear wands, with the glitter in it. Now
Yes.
my nieces and nephews play with it when they come over, but that little wand, in many ways kind of saved our marriage.
So
So,
it's the only the person holding the talking stick gets to talk.
exactly.
And when they're done, they'll hand you the talking stick and then you get to talk.
Yes. 100%.
That's how it works.
Yep. Welcome to recovery, ladies and gentlemen. Awesome. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. See you later. That's all for today. Thanks for joining us. And remember, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. Together, we can do the impossible.
To learn more about Mark and Steve and to listen to more podcast episodes, visit us at pbscpodcast.com. Everything expressed on the PBSC podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.